Hello, good evening, everyone. I have the honor to introduce to you the man who has the passion, um, whose work precedes him in Africa when it comes to promoting a sustained and inclusive wildlife economy in Africa. This man I met in a city park in Oxford in 2018, where he introduced me the work and the initiatives that he was working on in Africa. Later on, 2 years down the line, I joined him at Africa Leadership University, where he led a team and developed and mainstreamed a curriculum on wildlife economy for undergraduate students and also for the conservation MBA. Later on, he introduced me again to the AWE network. And today, this is the man who is going to talk to us today, mainstreaming the sustainable use of wildlife species. Him being Frank Voice, a resource economist. Thank you so much for inviting us. And Frank, over to you.
Wow, thank you very much, Victor. Very nice to see you too. So the title, Mainstreaming the Sustainable Use of Wild Species, you'll see in 2 slides. This is a talk that's really about a policy opportunity that's come up under the Convention on Biological Diversity. But what I'll do is I'll talk about this new opportunity, and then I'll also talk about sort of the historical legacy of this discussion around sustainable use of wild species in international policy. And then I'll introduce one particular measure that we might want to use to promote or to enable sustainable use to take place. So there's a lot of words on this, and so I do have the PowerPoint on our webpage for this event on the AWE website, and the link will be shared in the chat box, and so you may want to download it to look at some of the language again. But the first bit is just to look at the high vision of this. And so in December 2022, the governments got together for the 15th Conference of the Parties, which was delayed because of the COVID lockdown, and passed a resolution to launch the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has the vision of living in harmony with nature. And the way that I understand this is that it's saying living in harmony with nature, not next to nature. So this is not about nature on the other side of the fence. We're here and the animals are over there, but how do we live together? And this is this whole thing of mainstreaming sustainable use, this whole idea. What's also already embedded in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which came out in 2015, which is the document that has the Sustainable Development Goals in it. And there, our government said, we envision a world in which consumption and production patterns and use of all natural resources, from air to land, from rivers, lakes, and aquifers to oceans and seas, are sustainable. And so we have this, at the highest level of international policy, a commitment to living with nature and using nature. Now, in December of last year, when the parties met in Montreal, they passed a number of decisions. One of the decisions, Decision 23, which is less widely discussed, but really, really powerful, is on sustainable wildlife management. And that's that language on the bottom, CBD COP the DEC 1523. So that means the 23rd decision of the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there, our governments actually call for all stakeholders to promote the mainstreaming of the sustainable use of biodiversity, in particular that of wild species, into all relevant sectors. So we have a mandate that came out in December of last year to mainstream our use of nature, of wild nature, in all sectors. That could be medicine, it could be food, it could be building, it could be fuel, it could be cosmetics, it could be tourism, and so on. And so it's a very powerful statement, and that's what this talk is about, is sort of what is that statement, how do we unpack it, and how do we actually go with it? Now, that statement relates to one of the targets in this Global Biodiversity Framework that I mentioned, Target 9, quite directly. And that target says, ensure that the management and use of wild species are sustainable, thereby providing social, economic, and environmental benefits for people. So target 9 is, if you will, the sustainable use target, where our governments globally have called for the use of species to provide benefits for people, social, economic, and environmental benefits. The target's a bit longer. You can read the full text, but that's the just linking it to the promotion of sustainable use in all sectors. So one really interesting part of this discussion, and these two slides refer to that. Let me see if I can move my little picture so I can read what I've got on the screen. Here we go. Sustainable use is an area-based conservation measure. What's getting a lot of play about the biodiversity framework is the target to conserve 30% of terrestrial and inland waters and marine and coastal areas by 2030, which is the target 3, which is the second quote on the screen. Let me start, though, with the quote at the top and then come back to target 3. In that same decision 23, the governments in the preambular say why are they calling for sustainable use of wild species. And they say that sustainable wildlife management can significantly contribute to biodiversity conservation as opposed to alternatives. And the two alternatives in this paragraph, which is longer, so I've shortened it for the screen, are demand reduction strategies and alternative livelihood approaches, because sustainable wildlife management can result in land use changes that are positive, where these alternatives may result in land use changes that may be harmful to the environment and ecosystems. So our governments are actually saying demand reduction strategies, which is popular in many circles with respect to trade in wild species, or alternative livelihood approaches, may actually undermine the way we manage land. In short, if we can't manage the land in a way that we can get benefit, economic, social, environmental benefit from the wildlife, we may replace that wildlife with alternative land uses. It could be livestock, it could be cattle, what have you. So you link that back to the big target that's talked about in the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and it says ensure and enable this 30% conservation area, including through ensuring that any sustainable use where appropriate in such areas is fully consistent with conservation outcomes. So the governments have now said use mainstream wildlife use in all relevant sectors. We're going to do that because this could result in positive impacts on environment and ecosystems. And this actually links to the 30 by 30 target, the 2030 by 30% target that's in target 3 of the GBF. But see, it says fully consistent with conservation outcomes, the very last words in the slide. So now, what do we mean by conservation outcomes? So now this is where it gets tricky, and one has to think through this a little bit. It's interesting that in the Convention on Biological Diversity, they don't explicitly define conservation, though they do define biodiversity, sustainable use, ecosystems, and so on. But they define in situ conservation, which relates to this concept of 30 by 30 area-based conservation. And they say in the convention text itself that in situ conservation means the conservation of ecosystems and natural habitats and the maintenance and recovery of viable populations of species in the natural surroundings. So if we go back to the previous slide, the conservation outcomes in the very last line are conservation of ecosystems and natural habitats and populations of species. That then, in a sense, also links back to the GBF. So a modern discussion of that is target 5 in the Global Biodiversity Framework, again, adopted in December, which says ensure that the use, harvesting, and trade of wild species is sustainable, safe, and legal, preventing overexploitation, minimizing impacts on non-target species and ecosystems. So there you've got to feel that conservation outcomes are don't overexploit, minimize impacts on non-target species and ecosystems through as a result of use, harvesting, and trade of wild species. So wild species use, harvesting, and trade is good if it delivers conservation outcomes, which includes conservation outcomes at the landscape level, at the area level, which is what these bits of decision are explaining, of the decisions that came out. So now what do we actually mean by the word conservation? As I said, it wasn't defined in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it was defined in two key documents that came out before the convention was launched. That convention was launched in 1992, but it was, if you will, a follow-on to a key document that came out from the IUCN community in 1980 called the World Conservation Strategy. See if you can find it on the internet. It's an old, spectacular old document. And in 1980, that was the first time, you can see in the small print, that the governments used the term, that international community started to use the term sustainable development, living resource conservation for sustainable development. Now, the word biodiversity didn't exist in 1980, so they used the word biosphere in this definition. So in this definition, in 1980, which came out, by the way, under the signature of IUCN, UNEP, WWF, FAO, UNESCO, etc. So there was, in a sense, of an international agency strategy. It said that conservation is the management of human use of the biosphere so that it may yield the greatest sustainable benefit to present generations while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of future generations. Thus, conservation is positive, embracing preservation and maintenance, sustainable utilization, restoration, and enhancement of the natural environment. So here there's benefiting people, which now sort of disappears after 1980, and now has come back with the previous decisions that I showed you on Target 9, calling for the use of nature to benefit people in environmental, economic, and social terms. Then in 1991, IUCN and UNEP and WWF came out with a version 2.0 of this document that they called Caring for the Earth, for this strategy. And here they were even a bit stronger, and they said that the management of human use of organisms or ecosystems to ensure such use is sustainable is what conservation is all about. So if you will, conservation is the use of species, wildlife sustainably. And then it also includes, of course, protection, maintenance, rehabilitation, restoration, and enhancement of populations and ecosystems. So if we think through the logic of the development of policy, if these are the definitions, and the definitions are very much wrapped around mainstreaming the use of wild species, it has to be mainstreaming the use of wild species to deliver conservation outcomes, which means maintaining the species or increasing the population, and then maintaining the habitats and the landscapes in which they live. So they back in 1980, they sort of put this out as three objectives, which for those that are CBD folks on the call may say, this is almost what the CBD says, but not quite. And you can go back and see it's a little bit different. Interesting how different it is and how similar it is. So first, to maintain essential ecological processes. Second, to preserve genetic diversity. Sorry, biodiversity wasn't there. And third, to ensure the sustainable utilization of species and ecosystems, notably fish and other wildlife, forests, and grazing lands, which support millions of rural communities as well as major industries. So back in 1980, one of the objectives of conservation was to use species sustainably and ecosystems sustainably because they provided benefit to millions of people and to industries, which then in turn provide benefit to more millions of people. So you now have these three objectives disappeared in 1992 with the biodiversity objectives, in which sustainable use and conservation became two separate terms, but that's another discussion. So back to the quote that I just gave you, mainstreaming the sustainable use of wild species. Again, what we have is the government saying that we should promote this into all relevant sectors. In other words, we should put it out everywhere. Again, linking that back to 1980, so the one above is 2022, the one below, the management that will yield the greatest sustainable benefit. So conservation is about, if you will, is a very anthropocentric concept. It's about benefiting us through using nature sustainably. You might want to say responsibly, inclusively as well, but the emphasis is on sustainable. So what type of sustainability outcomes? We talked about the conservation outcomes. That's part of it. But if we take a broader look at sustainability, do we want to see come out of wildlife use? A lot of little words here, but all these words in the second column come out of the global biodiversity framework. So in that framework, we have a goal called nature's contributions to people, and two of the targets, which I've just referenced in previous slides. Target 5 is on the use, harvesting, and trade of wild species, and target 9 is on management and use of wild species. They have words in them that tell you this is the type of things our governments are looking for when we use wild species in various economic sectors. We want them valued, maintained, enhanced, sustainable, safe, legal. We want to prevent overexploitation, minimize impacts, reduce the risk of pathogen spillover, apply the ecosystem approach, respect and protect customary sustainable use, sustainable social benefits, economic benefits, environmental benefits, enhance biodiversity, and again, protect and encourage customary sustainable use. So I think we've got a pretty clear policy mandate, not only to use wildlife, but to be able to say, what do we expect that use to deliver? This is a set of sustainability outcomes that are not just saving animals and landscapes, but involve dealing with risks like pathogen spillover and dealing with, sustainability in general, and dealing with issues like legality and safety. So a very interesting list that one can build on. So now I'm going to switch a little bit from saying now I've made the case to say that we have a policy opportunity to really look at mainstreaming the sustainable use, but how do we actually roll that out? How do we actually mainstream the use of wild species into sectors, into various economic sectors, delivering two things, if you will. One, ensuring that the use is sustainable, and two, assuring stakeholders that it's sustainable. As many people on the call know, there's a lot of nervousness about the use of wildlife. There's a lot of nervousness about trade. We have a whole convention on international trade, in which our governments get together and say, well, we want to put some trade measures on because we're not sure we want to export rhino horn, say, or ivory, or this particular plant, or this particular fish, and so on. And so one approach that we're looking at the African Wildlife Economy Institute is to be able to implement the global biodiversity framework and promote the sustainable use of wild species through the use of voluntary standards, voluntary sustainability standards. These are standards for environmentally and socially responsible production and consumption. And what I've quoted here is just some of the language from the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. And I'll just mention the last bullet that says, have the potential to generate significant environmental, economic, and social benefits in developing countries. And so from the UN perspective, voluntary standards are a way in which we can actually enable the use of wild species to deliver these benefits that we've been talking about. And so this is a way to set up how the process of harvesting, of hunting, of fishing, of tourism, whether it's photographic tourism or hunting tourism, of foraging for plants, how that action actually is done in a way that provides sustainable outcomes. This is also important, this whole sustainable standards approach, is because it will allow the use of wild species to enter global value chains so that we can get these products into the international economy where they can, if you will, get the best return, create real economic value, create real livelihood values for producers and for people along the value chain and so on. So I put two pictures on the right there of two key organizations in this discussion. At the global level, the World Trade Organization, and at the continental level, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is slogan, creating one African market. At our way, we're particularly interested in AfCFTA, in that we can use the dynamic process underway now to reduce trade barriers in Africa to enable us to harvest and use and trade wild species and wild species products across the African continent. So for those of you in the Southern African space, and you're familiar with biltong, people that are not from that area may not know that biltong is a dried meat product, and a lot of it you can get made from wild meat from animals like kudu or springbok or impala or blesbok or wildebeest or what have you. If you can imagine taking that product of dried meat from Southern Africa and selling it around the continent, I even say just selling it to Lagos would have huge economic potential. It's nobody eats it in Lagos. It's not there, and it could be there, or they don't. Some probably do. It's a big city, but it's a huge potential. Tourism, opening up intra-African tourism, absolutely huge potential. That's not been tapped, which means reducing trade barriers to tourism, which in the African context is primarily about getting rid of visas to start with, so that Africans can visit each other's countries without silly visa requirements. It's a big problem, as many of you know, on the continent. So this is why we're saying use voluntary standards, use them to facilitate wildlife trade. We're particularly interested in intra-African wildlife trade. And then I'm going to end up with one example of a standard that is up and running and in use in Africa, and then suggest that we need to look at standards for other wildlife products as well. So this is the Fair Wild Standard, which envisions a world where biodiversity, people, and business thrive together. So that's a standard that looks at nature, people, and business. So it talks about the harvesting of plants. This is a plant-focused standard that will deliver sustainable use, will deliver landscape returns, and so on. It looks at the people side to make sure that the harvesters get a fair treatment and that communities are empowered in this. And then it also looks at good business practice, that the businesses engaged in this across the value chain are transparent, traceable, sustainably managed, etc. So it's integrating sustainability at the landscape level and at the biodiversity level, at the people community level, and at the enterprise business level. And what I've put there on the right are some examples of companies that Fair Wild have certified their products in Africa. Some in some in West Africa, some in the Horn of Africa, working on frankincense, and for example, baobab trade from Zimbabwe, or desert oils from Namibia. So this is real. This is already happening, but the scale is small. And with the mandate coming out of the Biodiversity Convention, we have a chance to scale this up. So let me see. So one case study of this, one example is a plant called Pelargonium that's harvested in the Eastern Cape that is certified by Fair Wild and processed through AfCFTA, which is in Wellington in the Western Cape, just outside of Cape Town. And here what they do is they actually rip the whole plant out of the ground because it's the root that has the medicinal value. And so, if you will, they sort of rip it out of the ground, kill the plant, if you will, cut off the roots, but they do it in such a way that it is sustainable, there is a return to the locals, and so on. What I understand about it, I haven't seen it in practice, is that people walk up into the hills in the Eastern Cape. They can take about 50 kilos on their back to pull it, carry it down. It then gets sold, gets trucked down to the Western Cape, to the Cape Town area, gets processed there, powdered up, and goes as a medicinal product that's sold around the world. So what happens, though, with it ripped out of the ground is that there are roots still left in the ground, and it regenerates. And so as the harvester goes up, and instead of being able to collect 50 pounds in an area of, say, 50 kilos, he can only collect 20. He says, it's not worth my time. He leaves that area for a few years until it regenerates and goes to another area. And so there's about 7,000 hectares that are certified in the area in which there's a sustained and continuous off-taking and regeneration that goes on. So this would be an example of harvesting of a wild product that is actually there, certified, traceable, and has entered global value chains, is actually sold around the world. That a lot of people are probably not even familiar with. So to end then, what the theme of this is mainstreaming the sustainable use of wild species, but in the context of this lecture series, which is on unlocking nature, we could talk about it just as well as saying unlocking Africa's wildlife economy. So to us, this mandate, this policy opportunity that comes out of the Convention on Biological Diversity presents a hugely exciting opportunity to actually use wild resources for food, for medicine, for fuel, for tourism, for building materials across the continent, build up the trade and use of these species, and in so doing, incentivize people to conserve landscapes where these species come from, because then they'll use the species that are there and not alternative livelihoods, and at the same time to increase incomes, livelihood levels, and so on, especially in rural communities. So I've just put on our X or Twitter address because you can go from there to the website. It might be easier to follow. Okay, I'll stop there.
Evening, everyone, and thank you, Frank, for that. We have a few questions in the chat, but I see Emmanuel has been engaging with you as you talk.
I see his question here. Should I answer his question here?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Based on you, how will you rate preservation wildlife approach, the conservation wildlife approach, and the future wildlife survival? Kenya's a really interesting case in this, and the Kenyans have learned a lot, and we've all learned a lot from Kenya. Kenya tried very nobly to maintain conservation of mammals, I should say, through non-use, through, if you will, non-consumptive use of the animals. Unfortunately, about 70% of the wildlife population is gone since the 1970s, when they stopped the use of wild animals. They didn't just stop hunting, they stopped also game ranching and so on. And so now the country's there's a lot of discussion about reopening use, not necessarily reopening trophy hunting and bringing old white guys from Europe down to shoot animals, but about meat, about having wildebeest compete with livestock, if you will, as a source of protein. So it's a very interesting study also because they did a different policy when it came to wild marine resources. So in Kenya, the people that live on the coast can harvest the resources. They can hunt. It's just called fishing. They can even bring in white men from America to do trophy fishing, and they do it on the Indian Ocean and in Lake Victoria. And so and they don't have everything right on their fishing. Nobody does. Fishing is very complicated with the open resource problem. But the Kenyans have this sort of dual culture that if it swims, you can consume it, but if it walks around on four legs, you can just take a picture of it. And so the policies, the structures are very running in parallel with each other. I think what we're going to see happen is, but Kenya has very good ownership and use rights, potentially. They have good land tenure rights. And so if Kenya starts to open up a wildlife use, it's based probably around food, more than it will be around trophy hunting or something like that. I think you might see it moving very quickly, because the landscape can hold the wildlife. We have a lot more biomass and livestock on the Kenyan landscape now than we used to in wildlife. So if you could imagine the wildlife being able to compete as a source of food, you could see the ranchers, the farmers starting to put more game on the land, and pretty soon that biomass starting to rise again. And we could replace that 70, get back to the stocks like they were in the 70s, within 10, 20 years, probably. Okay.
Cool. Thank you for that, Frank. Roland, we can take your question.
Well, I'm going to state the obvious. Let me go to my video as well. Boundaries, political boundaries, often difficulties when it comes to movement. Certainly when it like tourism and communities that have shared families across international boundaries. Now, I'm not sure if how well aware you have of CASA, which is the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Initiative, which is between 5 countries. It's Angola, Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And they've recently brought in, they're introducing a visa So those people, tourists that are visiting those three countries, that includes Chobe, Okavango, Bobwata National Park, Siodingwezi, Luana Luengi in Angola. By the way, I'm a protected area manager in Angola. So that's the first thing. So it's important that we support these initiatives where we have collaboration. And it's a use as well in our anti-poaching work, because the poachers would run into another country and then we couldn't get them. They would do vice versa. So but that's now changed. We are doing joint operations. And I don't know if you are aware of the Karamasana Association in Bobwata National Park. It's a San living within Bobwata National Park, and they have the harvesting of an indigenous plant called Devil's Claw. And it would, through cooperation between the 5 countries, it could spread. At the moment, it can't be done in Angola, but the Karamasana Association is doing incredible work, doing exactly what you're explaining about sustainable use of wild products. So just a point, and just bringing to your attention.
Thank you, Roland. Those are really interesting points. I think your point about the visa, I've heard about the visa plans for the CASA travel, and it's fabulous. In East Africa, they're a bit ahead of that, and they do have a joint visa for Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and I think Tanzania is still in the scheme too, which really helps. It helps people to do a regional tour, and that's great. And it's a great move forward. And there are examples like the Devil's Claw example that we need to look at. One thing I just would interject here is that I think one of the issues, now this is an interesting issue, is that, and we won't be able to debate it out in this short time on this call, is that we want to get products into the economy, into the broader economy. So we want products to be exported. So we want that Devil's Claw to be exported. So it's just not consumed locally. So those people can get the best dollar they can for it. We want any game meat to get into good restaurants and to be paid good money for it, and so on. And in so doing, we build economies, and we build networks, and we build value chains, and so on. There was another question about how do you deal with monitor sustainable use, and who will monitor it? That's one of the reasons for the sustainability standards, the voluntary standards. And I should say why the word voluntary standard is that in international trade policy, people do not want to have governments mandate things. Like recently, for example, the United Kingdom was trying to pass a law that say that Brits could not bring back a trophy from an African country or from any country from a hunting safari, which is a bit of a sort of regulatory by the state. And so the voluntary standards is a way to bring transparency and accountability into the marketplace, driven by the consumers, driven by the producers, and so on. But of course, behind that is the role for regulations and the role for governments to have oversight, and that the standards don't emerge, they have to do something about it. So there's no way we're going to talk about having, whether it's consumptive or non-consumptive use of wildlife, without a role for a regulatory framework. And that includes even the ecotourism and, transboundary ecotourism projects and so on. Prudence, over to you.
Yeah, sorry, Frank. There's a question from Sibyl where they ask, the question will always be, who will monitor sustainable use in legal trade when there are so many paper parks in spite of the great tourism income they generate, when CITES is so weak in controlling illegal trade, and when so many other factors, climate change, etc., also impact wildlife populations?
Oh my God, there's a whole lot. I saw a question. I didn't know if I can't answer all of that, but a piece of it is, this is what I was just saying, the role of standards and certification systems can play a big role, in which we actually have people like in Fair Wild recognizing, going in and auditing. They do a third party. So the way that works, they have a third party audit of a harvesting regime that checks on its social and environmental responsibility, reports on that. And if it meets the standard, it gets the label. People then buy that product because the label's on it and so on. So that's one use. Another use was CITES. CITES is weak in controlling illegal trade. Illegal trade isn't controlled by CITES. CITES is an international agreement. Illegal trade has to be controlled at the local level, at the national level. But what CITES does is governments globally sit down and say, for species A or species B, we think trade is a concern. So we've asking governments to do a study before they will give an export permit. So they're saying that, for example, if you would want to export ivory, you would need to have a study called technically a non-detriment finding that the government would have to have. And you'd have to, the government also issue a statement to say that this ivory was legally sourced. And so what CITES does is it sets up a framework internationally for governments to do a monitoring and evaluation on the threat of the trade to the species and on the legality of the trade before they issue a permit. So if we can facilitate governments to do those types of studies, then they can also play a key role ensuring that the trade in those species is legal and sustainable. So CITES is a framework for that can be used.
Cool. Thank you, Frank. Whilst we wait for Roland to see if he can get better connection, Emmanuel followed up on the question that you answered, and he said, wildlife-human interaction has been part of human history. Oral literature is an important part of storytelling, and through myths and totems, indigenous communities have been able to learn and promote wildlife conservation. It would be interesting to hear how you promote integration of indigenous and modern knowledge in your research and wildlife conservation work.
It's very, that's, I mean, I don't have to say much more than what he said. That is an area that needs to be studied and studied well. And it's true, not just in Africa, it's true around the world. In Europe, for example, there's a whole embedded tradition on mushroom harvesting, and people have and there was legal rights where people can go into national parks and harvest mushrooms, and it's been going on for centuries, and certain people have rights to it and so on, and understanding those rights to those resources and is really, really crucial. And so another aspect of, if you will, the governance is building youth systems like what Roland was talking about with Devil's Claw, based on indigenous practices and indigenous models. Now, of course, those would be based on that, and they can be adapted to modern technology and the use of apps and mobile phones and traceability schemes and so on. But building that in is a real big opportunity. Because it is true that across the continent, people do use the wild resources. For one, is a challenge everywhere on the continent, is it's a major source of fuel, is wild wood. People harvest wood for fuel. And yet we don't really have good schemes to ensure sustainable harvesting of wood, and that's an area to work on. So that would be one area that you could imagine going back and looking at the way communities have managed their sources of fuel wood, and how can we learn from that to develop sustainable wood harvesting programs.
Okay, cool. We have a follow-up comment from Sibyl, the one who asked about CITES, and they say, well, we have seen how third-party agencies like Vera certify CO2 offsetting projects. Reason to be very cynical, these systems are too easy to corrupt.
Okay, then what do? We're human beings. We are corruptible. That's for sure. We have to. We need to develop processes and systems. As one other person just said, we just talked about, CITES on its own doesn't do this. The CBD is a policy framework, which is really exciting, but it doesn't have any teeth. It doesn't have any power that way. I think the Vera standards are really quite useful. They're really interesting. They're trying to do a nature credit standard now, which I don't know if it's going to work, but it's interesting. It's one of the best approaches we have is third-party certification schemes. It's not without its faults, but it is a way to move forward. And the reality is that we've got people are either going to use the wild resources and use them sustainably, which is what our governments are calling for, or if they're not allowed to use them, you end up with the Kenyan model in which they replace the wildlife with livestock and crops. And so the landowners there have just pushed the wildlife away over the last 50 years and brought in cattle, goats, sheep, camels. They have a huge camel industry, livestock camel industry in the country. And the kudu, the wildebeest, the impala have disappeared. So how do we bring it back? One approach is standards. It's not the only, but it's one approach. Another approach is using CITES effectively to actually issue export permits for responsibly harvested products and so on.
Thank you, Frank. I am learning a lot from what you're saying, so thank you. Roland, we can take a question if you would like to unmute.
Well, I want to, can I make it? Okay, go ahead, Roland.
Can you hear
me? I hope so.
Can you hear me now? Okay, just to an idea about the ensuring it's sustainable and then it's controlled. We tend to look at it as countries rather than systems, and systems are what it's about, really. So CASA is based on the Okavango-Zambezi catchment, and it involves 5 countries. So rather the whole country being involved, we just look at what part of the system's involved, and the CASA Secretariat would be well positioned to bring in researchers to make sure it's sustainable, and also to educate the local communities about how it can be used. And what's happening at Bobata is equally applicable to Devil's Claw in Angola, and there's no reason why it can't be done. So maybe we're looking at countries when we should rather be looking at systems. And I think the Zambezi or Okavango is a perfect example where it can be done, and 5 countries can be involved, rather than looking at the whole country, just look at the part of the system. Just an idea.
No, Roland, you're 100% right. You have to take a landscape approach to this. And so what offtake you can take, what species you can use, whether you can actually harvest or not because of the fragility of the species, has to be done at the landscape level. But sadly, we also then have to deal with the fact that decisions are made in capital that affect the whole country. So how to get, say in Angola, how to get Luanda to devolve decision-making to the landscape level, to the communities and to the businesses that operate in that landscape. And if we can do that, which CASA is doing a lot of work in that direction, it's fabulous. Yeah, the complex system is at the landscape level. The legal frameworks that are imposed on it from the outside have to be looked at to say, can those frameworks be enabling and not inhibiting?
Okay, I agree. I think that with CASA, it's a step forward. So the Angolan government and Luanda have signed onto it, okay, onto the concept. The implementation is a bit more difficult, but given time, using it as a model, it can gradually, step by step, be more encompassing when it comes to the resource management in terms of cross-border, the use of things like Devil Claw. Just an idea, but it's there, and it's working, sort of. And you know, I think there should be more initiatives like CASA, and then when it works, then the politicians come on board because it gets them votes. Local communities are happy, everyone's happy, and they are doing the right thing internationally, and they're seen as leaders. So, you know, let's make it work, and then I think the politicians will see the wisdom and then let it expand.
Thank you, Roland. I don't know if Keith Lindsay would like to unmute. They seem to be interacting with you on the chat. I don't know if they'd want to unmute and ask you questions, Frank.
I've got Keith's note. Hi, Keith.
Hello.
Hi, Keith.
Yeah, I asked a couple of questions. I mean, one is about international supply chains. You talk about kind of globalized markets and, you know, international trading of commodity, wildlife as commodities. And that somehow is a magic solution to conservation issues. But it is the case that international supply chains break the link between external demands in countries far away from the source, such as China, and the local ability to supply sustainably. how can globalized supply chains with multiple source countries and active illegal wildlife trade sector running alongside that be equated with well-established sustainable systems of subsistence use that have been developed over centuries. This is often pointed to as an example of sustainable use, but the international globalized supply chains are nothing like these locally based responsive systems.
Okay, that's a very big topic for the time we have here, but well said, well put in, and certainly something that needs to be debated and discussed and analyzed in detail. What we're looking at is how what do you call it? You say active illegal wildlife trade sector. One of the challenges is to figure out how to get that trade sector to be an active legal wildlife trade sector. And if there is an international demand, how can we service that demand sustainably? And so one of the challenges that we've had with some of the products, and this again, it gets to landscapes and the species, is the perception that the demand is far outweighs the supply. And then the discussions have often been to try and limit the demand or reduce the demand, which, as I noted earlier in the talk, the governments have said, no, maybe that isn't quite always the way to go. It might be, but it's not quite always the way to go. And the question might be to say, how can we increase the supply and what will drive an increase in supply? And then you can talk about, can the supply increase in time to meet the demand and all that? And those are huge discussions around whether you open up the trade in the current stocks of rhino horn, for example. But opening up trade in globalized supply chains doesn't just mean selling to China. It means selling from Zimbabwe to Kenya, for example, or from Zimbabwe to South Africa to open up international trade. The other day, we were in a biotrade festival in Johannesburg where we had a booth and we were providing mopani worms. For those from not to Southern Africa, it's a caterpillar type of animal that has high in protein insect food. And we actually, my colleague Wiseman and Dovlu went down into Joburg and found 40 different suppliers of mopani worms, bringing it in from all over the region. So there is an international trade in mopani worms, which is really cool. Is it sustainable? Keith, it's not certified yet. There aren't people looking at it and looking at the harvesting regimes, but I haven't seen that we're running on mopani worms, but we might be. Other species, it might be more difficult. Some species you can move into international trade quicker than others, of course.
I'm not concerned about mopani worms. I'm concerned about pangolins.
Oh, you're in the pangolins.
I'm concerned about elephants and rhinos and giraffes. I mean, you know, this is a grotesque oversimplification to equate mopani worms to mammals.
No, I wasn't equating them. I was giving an example of a wild species trade.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there's different trades that can work. Trade in impala meat, trade in zebra meat. One of the things I've been talking to Zimbabweans about, and it's sort of a chuckle, and I ask Zimbabweans, just anecdotally, do you eat zebra? And the response I often get back is, no, we don't eat donkey. But other parts of the continent do eat zebra. I used to have zebra meat in Kenya when we could get zebra meat there when it was legal. So there's a potential that the Zimbabweans who don't have a taste for zebra could sell it to their Kenyan customers. And the Kenyans, on the other hand, tend to eat less pork, and so they could sell the warthog to Zimbabwe. So those are two types of species that are in plenty of abundance, and we could be increasing value chains around trade in warthog meat and in zebra meat. We're still putting the government oversight through a CITES convention on trade in more threatened species like rhinos, like you're talking about. And that's where CITES steps in. Okay. Oh, there's a question also that popped up about can lion hunting. That's also a very controversial one. And it's also a very interesting one for the talk about wild species. So let me just take a second on that. The term wild was very much in use in that World Conservation Strategy in the 1980 publication. In 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity only has the term wild 3 times. The word disappeared. Now, in the Global Biodiversity Framework, it comes back to 7 times, more than double. So the word wild has come back into international policy, but we don't have a clear definition of it. I was on emails this week with a chap from SANBI, Southern African National Biodiversity Institute, about what do we mean by wild? And the government of South Africa says wild includes animals, fish, and so on, but wildlife, but it doesn't say what makes it wild as opposed to just life. And this is where the whole issue of breeding and ranching animals, where does it become sort of a bred animal and where is it a wild animal? And the part of the canned lion hunting is wrapped around that, the breeding of the animals, not necessarily what they're used for, but what they're bred for. And one of the things in that, and I'll just give an example of how complicated this it isn't all, it's oversimplified, Keith, in a way, because it's a short talk, but it is complicated. So in IUCN, there's standards for lion breeding. There's a lion breeding standard, how much light, how much food, and so on. And that's used by lion breeders in Europe, North America, around the world, who breed up African lions in captivity, and then they spend their whole life in captivity in the zoo industry, in the London Zoo or the San Diego Zoo or what have you. And so there is a standard about what is considered from the IUCN community an acceptable way to breed a lion. So one of the things one can do in the canned lion industry in South Africa would be to say, are they up to these standards? Are they breeding these lions up to the IUCN standards? And then one might ask if those standards themselves are robust enough too. But they have been widely used for a long time in the lion breeding industry that goes into the zoo industry as opposed to the ecotourism or hunting industry. So that's the first part about it. But then you do have the question of, is that bred lion wild? And so there is a continuum and there is a discussion, and SANBI's done some very interesting work on trying to think through a gradient of sort of what do you call it, like a lion is a livestock to lion is pure wild. And it has to do with the landscape and how the animal lives and so on. But it's a thing we haven't really unpacked well at the international level. CITES doesn't have a definition for wild. And CITES, what they often do when they do it in the plant side and the animal side, they often say that the way to deal with threats on a wild animal is to start a breeding program and start a cultivation program. And so they, for example, in the CITES, they have 4 approved captive breeding organizations for rhinos in South Africa, of which one was just sold, as many of you know, from the private owner to African Parks, an NGO. And so they've sort of said the way to deal with the threat in the wild is to have non-wild cousins or something. And that's complicated. And we have to, that's going to be something that we'll continue to debate about, is what makes, how wild is wild and what makes it wild. And so with the lion breeding, I would say the first step would be to say, what are the standards in the breeding practice? And then we can ask about what you do with the animal, whether it sits in a zoo in prison in Europe for its life, or does it get released into some reserve and either is shot at with a camera or with a gun, which is the use of the species. But the breeding issue is an issue.
Cool, thank you, Frank. I think we'll take a question from Emmanuel. He was traveling earlier on, so I think he can unmute and ask his question.
Good evening. Thank you, Frank, for the great presentation, great insights, and it's quite true now. One size might not fit all. Even in Kenya, we have different approaches. Some of the areas, especially in northern rangelands, where wildlife protected areas under the government are very few, but wildlife numbers have done well because there is active community involvement through the conservancy model of wildlife conservation. Some of the areas in southern Kenya, at least doing quite well, but the last few months or the last few years, I think you've seen the proposal to tap into the carbon credits, because though in the long belief it has been always like it's only the forest which serve as big carbon sinks, but even grasslands have been, proved to really hold quite an amount of carbon. And I've seen the proposal to, encourage the local communities living in the grassland areas who are running enterprises based on wildlife to tap that potential in the carbon credit market. I don't know whether it's something you will support or you like to propose, because it has all been about, having an enterprise based on wildlife, either tourism through the lodges or community members selling some artifacts which are based on, their indigenous knowledge in carving or in probably basketry and the like. But a carbon credit market is a huge potential, which we might encourage people who are preserving wildlife or the wildlife areas to tap into. I don't know, Frank, what's your take on this?
Quickly, yeah, carbon credit's an interesting market. I should say, this to tie in with this previous discussion, your customer in a carbon credit is usually going to be somebody that's overseas, distant, not at all connected to those communities. So it's not too dissimilar to a Chinese or a Vietnamese consumer of an African product like a rhino horn. Your customer is remote, distant, and so on. So one has to think about that, what connectivity there is in that market. But given that, there are people that want to pay for carbon, and there are markets for that. And so if one is managing a landscape and can figure out how to find a customer for carbon, they should go for it. Now, one of the challenges I think we're seeing is that the traditional approach to carbon was you have to create new and additional carbon stocks. So you have to actually restore carbon into the system. So you can't just get paid for having a national park. I, for example, have worked quite a bit on mangrove carbon projects, and one of the biggest mangrove carbon projects in the world was in Senegal, and it was run by Danone, which is a large French yogurt company, and Danone also owns Evian, which is an upmarket water brand, and they wanted to plant mangroves. So they had a wetland carbon that would then resonate marketing-wise with their selling bottled water, their Evian water. And it's a very interesting project. You can read up on the web. They planted thousands and thousands of mangroves. From an ecological perspective, however, and I was working on this with IUCN and with the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, we weren't fully comfortable with it because they were doing physical planting of plants where, from our analysis, it wasn't so much about the planting as it was about the re-wetting of the area, that the areas had become too salinated because of upstream dams, because of causeways blocking the flow of fresh water into these estuaries that they planted, which were Casamas and Saloum, if people know the area in Senegal, gorgeous areas. And so they got a carbon credit, but was it an ecologically responsible carbon credit? Well, maybe not. It's a bit like the story about ranching animals. So they put in the plants, they sequestered carbon, but did they do it in a way that really made ecosystem or landscape sense? They did get the credit. We actually wrote the carbon credit protocol for the UNFCCC through IUCN to enable them to get the credit for planting mangroves. And closer to you, Emmanuel, you've got the famous Makoko Pamoja project on the south coast of Kenya that's sort of a poster child for community-based carbon credits. So yes, this is a type of ecosystem service that revenues can be generated from, but I think one has to be careful about sort of getting overly enthusiastic about it. It's very expensive to do. We analyzed the project in Kenya extensively, and there's a report on it with IUCN on investment in mangrove carbon that I helped to write. The amount of money that went in to actually get the credit far exceeded the money that came out. And so it required a whole lot of donor support, which actually came through the Earthwatch Institute field trips to actually do the baseline assessments and so on to be able to get the credit. But look at it, sure. I'm particularly interested in mangrove, and I should say too, because there's the payment for not losing carbon, which is the REDD+ story. So the one is you get paid to sequester more carbon, planting mangroves or other trees, and the other option is if we don't get paid, we're going to let this carbon go. We're going to deforest. We're going to degrade the landscape, and that's called REDD+. And that's a little bit more problematic, but it's an interesting model, and there's some good success in countries like Zambia, and certainly worth looking at. It's part of the wildlife economy for sure.
Cool. Thank you, Frank. I hope Emmanuel's answered. Andy, you can unmute and ask your question.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm a bit hesitant. I'm feeling very stupid at the moment, but I hope this will give us an opportunity to talk about values. To me, at the moment, the driver of our current global economic system seems very much driven by financial profit as quickly as we can, with other externalities ignored as best we can. Is there an opportunity in the approach you're talking about to have a benefit to nature, a benefit to communities, and an economic, in terms monetary benefit, to be a triple bottom line? And is there also an opportunity for Africa to change our global economic system by driving these values from where you guys are? And maybe that's an opportunity to incorporate our traditional knowledge, where we think longer term, and of the wider community, the living community, not just the human-centric bit. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, Andy. It
Cool.
makes perfect sense. And I think if you saw what these sustainability standards, I should say, if you're interested in the standards approach, there's a whole website on sustainability standards run by the International Trade Center in Geneva. And they've got all of them up there, and description of them, loads of them. They're all wrapped around how to have a commercially viable enterprise that is environmentally and or socially responsible. So the whole idea is to be able to first to to enable companies to move in that direction and to be able to demonstrate that, and then to provide assurance to stakeholders, consumers, investors, regulators, that these things are delivering multiple benefits, that they aren't just let's make lots of money. I mean, one of the lines that I often hear people say, well, if you let people just harvest the animals, they take them all out. But people don't do that. The cattle ranchers never do that. They harvest them with a quota. They have their own set quotas and so on. But do they harvest, even with the cattle ranchers, are they inclusive? So, in Africa, there's a real need not to have the economy or the wildlife economy captured by elites. And so can you ensure that the local harvester, the local landowner actually benefits? And that's one of the role of these standards, is to be able to have a structured, formal way in which you can actually guide the business to be responsible, and then you can assure people in the value chain that their responsibility is there. Fair Wild, I was talking to somebody in Fair Wild. They were just having a big discussion. This comes back to global value chains. In Uzbekistan, of all places, with licorice. And so they harvest wild licorice in Uzbekistan that goes into the global market all over the place. But how do we know when we buy that stuff it's responsibly done? One of the ones I put up on the slide and I mentioned was frankincense. The frankincense is a sap that's been harvested from wild trees in Somaliland, Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, since biblical times and before. How do we know when we buy that frankincense that the sourcing of it is responsible? This is where Fair Wild comes in. We'll take it closer for the Southern Africans on the phone. When you go to your local biltong shop and buy some kudu biltong, A, how do you know it's kudu? And B, how was that animal treated? And C, how was the community and the employees treated that were in that whole value chain that brought that kudu biltong to you? Right now, I've not seen any certified biltong in South Africa that actually demonstrates their environmental and social responsibility. I think the first people to do it are going to make a packet, because there's a big demand for environmental and social responsibility in Africa. People want to see that their products are well made. So that's how you deal with it, I think.
Brilliant. And if we get it right, the other 70% of the planet come on board as well. Brilliant.
Yeah,
Thanks ever so much.
I have this idea of Africa supplying indigenous game meat to the world, properly made, climate resilient, community responsible, and not all this factory farm cattle ranching in places like the Netherlands, but free range, open, good, organic, community responsible protein. And Africa could actually flip it around and be a major source of actually really good meat too. The food is fabulous. And that's the value chain story. Maybe we don't do rhinos yet, Keith. We can start with wildebeest. There's plenty of them. I think there could be more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Frank, for that. Before we get to Marty, there's a question in the chat from Sophia, they say, how can indigenous knowledge reach the whole world?
That's, oh my gosh. Or do you want it to reach the whole world? What I didn't talk about, there's a whole nother, I talked about sustainable use and conservation. I just briefly glossed over it, the access to genetic resources. There's a whole agreement under the Convention on Biological Diversity on access and benefit sharing with respect to genetic resources. And that's very much focused on indigenous local knowledge and trying to come up with international agreements that those indigenous and local knowledge can A, be used, but B, be used in a way that those local people benefit, because you don't want the knowledge to be stolen. And they talk, so what if there is a plant in the middle of the Democratic Republic of Congo that can cure baldness? Well, great. All these old guys are going to like to have baldness cured. But if we then were to take that plant and put it into some pharmaceutical company in the UK or in Switzerland, all the money would go there. And so one of the things is you don't want it just to become all global. You want it to become global in a way that the values go back locally. And that's the whole raison d'etre of the Nagoya Protocol, which is actually having some impact. South Africa, I know, has very good legislation and policies on it. They're working very hard on it. I did a project in Myanmar with the United Nations Environment Program where we tried to link access and benefit sharing with the national parks, because the national parks have a terrible relationship with the community. So we thought this could help build a better community relationship. But other places, it doesn't work so well. So, for example, the U.S. government, my government, as you can tell by my accent, hasn't ratified the Nagoya Protocol, and for that matter, hasn't ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity. So some governments aren't at the table where they should be, and others are actually working very hard on this indigenous knowledge story.
Oh, thank you. Marty, you can unmute and ask your question.
Well, yeah, thanks, Francis. I think I've forgotten my question a few times, but that's all good. I think I'm trying to sort of there's a couple of things where often these things are measured by ethical and what is cruel and what is utilization and what is as you say, a wild animal and what is a pet and what is a domesticated animal and whatever. And I think that's where the politics of it gets very complicated. And yeah, I'm not too sure whether you've got any sort of specific comments on that. For a lion, then it's not allowed because it's a cat or something like that. But for a springbok, it's okay. So just maybe some sort of thoughts on that, or is it how endangered the animal is means we can or can't utilize it? That's the sort of first part of the question, and then. The second one is maybe if you can just talk about values. So obviously, and I'm talking about number values, money. Has it been calculated what the value is of the illegal wild meat industry in the whole of South Africa or Africa for that matter? And how would it increase if it were all legalized, or would it increase? And the whole hunting thing, because again, hunting is a contentious thing, but as you mentioned, it is a great source of jobs and employment and utilization of for biltong and meat and all of those other things. And then I mean, in terms of different species, the springbok behind me are culled every year because the numbers are so high. And that word culling is an awful word for a lot of people, but it's almost a necessary thing. And again, this is very contentious, but like in the Kruger Park, where the numbers of elephant are high, where they're actually affecting the environment and the biodiversity of other species, it's necessary. And then why not utilize those resources for the benefit of conservation? So that's just my bits and pieces.
Okay, the ethics is a really interesting issue because people do have ethical values and some people have different values. I look at the springbok behind you in the photograph and I think dinner. Other people think other things. So to me, it's a beautiful animal to put on your dinner table. And it's my line, and I joke in Africa, it's not how many animals I've seen, but how many I've eaten. But that's just me. That's my view. I put food above photography as on my sort of list of things. But other people have different views on this, and quite serious. And there are a lot of people that feel that a lot of these animals are sentient and that we should actually not touch them at all. We have to respect those views. The debates in two things in the hunting that tie in with the ethics and with the value side too. I'll come back to that. I'll give you one from Canada a few years ago, but first on this trophy hunting ban that was going on in the UK, which has now been kicked into the long grass by the House of Lords. Most of the sentiment in favor of banning the import of trophies from overseas was wrapped around ethics. It wasn't really they talked about it's going to conserve the animals, but no, it's just, we don't like this. This is not a type of industry we would like. And one of the proponents of it, one of the things they wanted to be able to do was to say that they banned the import of the trophies from the Big Five. But there was a bit of a problem with that because one of the Big Five, nobody really cares so much about it. That's the buffalo, and there's plenty of them. And so they aren't on Asadi's list, and they aren't endangered. And so they'd have to have the Big Five minus one that they were able to ban. But a lot of the discussion, and I watched quite a bit of the debates on my computer screen, was really around people's emotional values. And, they have those values and they're real and we have to deal with it. Now, let me bring that over to Canada and then bring it back to the value of these things in an African context. Years ago, when I was at IUCN headquarters, the Canadian government had put in and it was run by government, a very big new program to enable more hunting, to increase hunting, to get more hunting revenues. And a big part of the business model of the Canadian Wildlife Service was based on revenues from hunting. And then they found, and they'd done a wonderful program, set it all up with all the ethics and the standards and the training. And guess what? They didn't have many customers because a lot of Canadians just don't like to hunt anymore. I've never hunted. I've stepped on mosquitoes and stuff, but I've never killed anything. So they just lost a customer base. People, so you can't. It's a bit like how many people want to take a photograph of an animal sitting in the back of a vehicle? Some do. How many people want to hunt? So what you're finding is less and less people are actually interested in hunting or in international hunting. But there's still a lot. I mean, there's a million registered hunters in the country of France, for example. And so they didn't get the revenues they thought they would get because there just wasn't enough demand for hunting. They had the supply, they had the systems in place, but they didn't have any demand. And so you could find that I could be out there saying, oh, I think we should be exporting wildebeest meat to the Middle East, around the world. And we find out people have all gone vegan and they don't want to eat this meat anymore. So that's an issue that you have to face, is people have different values and ethics do drive things. Now, whether those ethics should lead the legislation becomes an interesting issue. Should you outlaw me wanting to eat a wildebeest because you think wildebeest should just walk around until they die? Okay, then we have debates on that, and that's what governments and parliaments and democracy is all about. The values in this, I haven't seen a real valuation number on the value of informal or legal wild meat in Africa. It may be out there. There is a wild meat, I think it's wildmeat.org website that has a lot of research on wild meat. It's been put out by folks that are working on this area. And after this call, or tomorrow, not after this call, I think I might look and see, but I haven't seen numbers on it. But there is a lot of consumption. We know that, and I know that with anecdotes around the place, Cameroonians eat a lot of game meat. There's been a lot of push in places like Cameroon to replace game meat with factory farm chickens. And just talking with people in Douala and in Yaoundé, they all sort of go, we don't like these factory farm chickens. We like the good stuff. And so the demand is there, but now do they have the governance in place to harvest that stuff? That's what we need to work on.
Sustainably, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there is that taste. I mean, for that meat. I talked about earlier, the Mapani worms. There's a big demand. I haven't tried Mapani worms yet either. I'm just a bit of a wimp. Or chimpanzee meat, for example. Students of mine from Sierra Leone, from Guinea, from Rwanda, chimpanzee meat is very popular, but it's not my taste. I'm a bit more simple, but so there is I think one can verify that there's a lot of demand, a lot of trade. I mean, I had a student looking at the chimpanzee meat market in Sierra Leone, and they harvest this chimpanzee meat and they export it to neighboring countries. So there's a value chain there that goes international. Is it legal? Well, he said it's not quite legal, but it's not quite illegal. When things are bad and people are poor, the government sort of turns a blind eye and allows the animals to be harvested. So is it sustainable? I suspect probably not, and it needs to be looked at.
No, cool. So the one thing I wanted to add is you said when you see the Springbok behind me, you think of dinner. I think of World Cup. Please, Springboks, go Bokke.
Yeah, especially after the last two matches. We've got one more to go for the South Africans. They just got to beat those All Blacks this time.
Cool. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you.
My buddy Wiseman has got his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I can tell you something. You're missing nothing from not eating mopani worms. There's absolutely nothing there. But before we get to Wiseman, I don't know if Mark would like to unmute. Mark Lotte had a question. I don't know if you'd like to unmute and ask his question. Yes, he said he'd like me to. Can I please read out his question? He says, don't we run a systemic problem that trade for profit moves the resources away from those who depend on it for their subsistence to wealthy communities that use the resource optionally? Shouldn't the focus be on ensuring food security on the least amount of land possible, thus opening up space for wilderness and biodiversity?
Oh, interesting. So you imagine that if we all right, I'm just doing a thought exercise here. What if we said that only the local harvesters of the grapes around Stellenbosch should drink the wine because it's their wine, and you shouldn't allow that wine to go to Johannesburg or to go to Port Elizabeth? It should stay just with those communities. It's their wine. They should have the first hit and so on. And I think a lot of people around Stellenbosch and so on might say, yeah, we'll keep it ourselves. We'd be happy to. They'd be broke. There wouldn't be enough of an economy around that. So rather than thinking about just and there this you'll see there's a debate on this. I was just on emails today on this today, but look at the wine economy around Stellenbosch, a place that you've got restaurants, hotels, weddings, bar mitzvahs, birthday parties, you've got cheeses, you've got olive oils, you've got Fynbos hiking trails, mountain biking. There's a whole diversified mosaic. Now, we can go back to the Casa story, take a landscape and look at a whole mosaic of things you can do now, not just the meat, but the ecotourism, the carbon credits, the mopani worms, the firewood, and so on. And if we can build a mosaic of small, medium enterprise in a wilderness landscape along the lines that it's been successfully done in a agricultural landscape, here the wine landscape around Durbanville, Stellenbosch, and even down to Hermanus, maybe we're going to get somewhere. We would be able to have a lot more income for those communities. And those communities, let's say that you've got a beautiful piece of Springbok loin, and the local person can maybe pay 20 Rand for it. If you could put that loin in a fancy restaurant or Hussar Grill in Midrand in Gauteng, you could probably sell it for 300 Rand. That could conceivably bring more bucks all the way back down the value chain. Now, interesting, now this ties in, there's a big discussion in the wild meat industry about allowing wild meat only for local villages and then having urban folks either all go vegan or eat factory farmed chickens, and that the wild meat should only be local. In Kenya, when they did allow the game meat trade in the 1990s, when I lived there and worked at the African Wildlife Foundation, they only allowed the meat to go to the city, which is really interesting. They didn't allow the locals to eat it. It only went to the elites, to the tourists, at a famous restaurant called the Carnivore, but at other restaurants too. So trying to do those types of trade barriers in a country, so you can imagine saying that a village in the Northern Cape, they could harvest their Springbok, but they couldn't sell Springbok to Cape Town, and there would be trade barriers. It would be, I think it'd be very hard to enforce that. Plus, it would mean that the value that wouldn't be, the potential value for that Springbok wouldn't be realized. So what we want to do is take the Northern Cape story. You drive through the Northern Cape now and you see a couple breeds of sheep all over the place. If the sheep can live in that landscape, why aren't the springbok there? So why don't we see tens of thousands of springbok instead of sheep there? And there's culture and there's history and there's veterinary control and regulations and so on. But conceivably, you could take a landscape and you could get some carbon, you could get some venison, you could get some hide for, we haven't even talked about hide for leather, or talked about bones for both for medicinal reasons and what have you, and so on and so forth. You can imagine that rural community having a whole mosaic of products, some of it which is consumed locally and some of it which is exported, like the wine industry. But now it's the wildlife industry.
Oh, that was an interesting juxtaposition, Frank. Thank you. Peter says, on the topic of ethics, he said earlier on, he says, ethics are not universal. A love of wildlife is not going to save it. We base our conservation on Western perception of what is right. The rural people of Africa will decide whether wildlife persists, irrespective of what we think are wrong or right.
Well, that's true. And I can say, let me give you an example, not just from Africa, but from the UK. In the UK, there's a lot of deer. Okay, all right, and they taste pretty good too, but it's not as good as African wildlife. But there you go. There's a lot of wild deer, but those wild deer by many farmers are seen as competitors to their livestock, to their cattle and their sheep, in that they compete for the grass. And so in some of the farms, the farmers the cattle ranchers and the sheep ranchers, if you will, in the UK, will actually pay hunters to come in and kill all the females. Kill all the females so they don't have any more babies. We get rid of these bloody animals. They go. Other parts of the country, and there's a great one that I'm looking at up in the north of the UK. The farmer got so tired of the deer taking the grass away from his cattle, he gave up on the cattle, and now he sells game meat. And he has game meat in the big grocery stores. He has both farm meat, which is fenced, and he has wild harvested meat from neighboring farms. And so there's different people doing different things. And what you may find, even in an African context, some people may say, we don't want to deal with kudu and stuff. We like sheep. We're doing sheep. And other people may say, hey, forget the sheep. We're going back to Impala and to Hemsbach. I mean, you drive up to the Northern Cape and you get to Kalahari, did I say that right? Almost. And you go right into the park and there's stacks of Hemsbach, but there's none just outside of the park. There could be. Why isn't there? Could we build an economy that could have more Hemsbach out of the park? I don't think it would be a photographic-based economy, but it probably could be a meat-based economy because Hemsbach really cook up well. You know.
Cool. We have a question from Sibyl. They ask, aren't we eating far too much red meat for our health and for the health of our planet already, and would need drastic change for our diets rather than adding game meat to our domestic cattle or pork, etc. consumption?
Well, I would replace it, right? And in fact, there's a number of people I know now that are vegetarian plus game meat. They only eat wild meat or they eat their vegetables and so on. So they don't eat factory meat. And they don't eat all this hormone injected, bred up stuff. That, and when I'm in the Cape, I stay with my mother-in-law in Durbanville, and I drive to Stellenbosch, and I go by all these big chicken houses and all these animals that only live 28 days, and they never see sunlight, and then they end up in Nando's and Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I think about those animals, and I go, couldn't they just knock those things down and put Impala there instead? And so what you might find is that we would be better off having an ecological, climate-friendly wild meat diet, and we might eat less of it. It might be more expensive to produce than this industrialized meat that we've got ourselves into. And South Africa is very much, and much of Africa is into it, especially the mass production of chickens that we do. We slaughter millions of chickens every minute around the planet, millions and millions and millions, and people don't hardly say a thing about it. I'd like to see if we could replace the chickens with natural products that would help the landscape, but that's my story. But yes, we do eat too much meat, probably.
Thank you, Frank. We had a hand earlier on from Wiseman Global. I don't know if he would still like to address you. Wiseman, if you can, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prudence, and thank you, Francis, for the presentation. I wanted to comment earlier on the issue around the game meat and the demand itself. But I think you have already touched on it. But just to contribute, there is also a concern around it to say, is there real demand, particularly in the local communities or in the rural areas, or is it because there is the meat itself is cheaper to harvest, so you don't need to pay for it. So if you are to commercialize it, are the local people going to buy it if you're looking at local communities? Or only we have to look at how we can take it to the global markets, for example? Because if you interact with some of the communities or people working in that space, they start talking about that you can't really sell it at a higher price, or at a price that will be able to give you fair returns, or if you're selling it to the local villages. They demand it for the purposes that they harvest it cheaply from the bush, and they don't need to pay anything. So looking into those issues and looking into those concerns, how do we then build a functioning local market to support the bushmeat, for example? So it was just a comment, but I think you have already touched on it when you talked about incorporating it into the restaurants and building the value chains and so forth. Maybe you can comment more on it as well. Thanks.
Just for everybody, Wiseman's our postdoc at Awe working on this topic, wild meat. So we've ended up spending a lot of time on wild meat, probably because the session is at dinner time. And it's just not the best time to have a talk. For some of us might be getting hungry. The what do you call it? Building value chains beyond the wild meat. So, for example, I've always been surprised that if you drive across countries in Africa, you never see anybody on the side of the road selling game meat. Why, really, you'll see. In fact, I see coffee stands now, going around, and that's pretty cool, and that's nice. It's probably cultivated coffee. You can still get wild coffee, by the way, from Ethiopia. That's from wild coffee forests, but I haven't seen that in South Africa. I've seen it in Switzerland only, where it's imported from Ethiopia. But you could imagine those villages, wise, not only having butchers that would then harvest the meat, butcher the meat, have local restaurants, put stuff up, at whatever bus stops, bring stuff into the market towns and so on. There's no reason why that industry can't develop, and there can be more value added. And I should say, we've been talking about meat, but a lot of the economy potential on the continent is with plants as well. And so there's the food plants, the baobabs, there's the fragrances like what do you call it? Frankincense that I mentioned earlier. There's the medicinal plants like the example that I gave in the PowerPoint presentation from the Eastern Cape and so on. And so when you're looking at this economy, it's not just a focus on the four-legged animals, it's a focus on all the wild resources. Tilapia, major source of protein on the continent, and major opportunity is the whole fishing side as well, that we haven't even touched on.
Cool. I don't see any other questions from
Good.
anybody else.
Dinner time for me.
Yes, absolutely.
And I actually do have a little bit of springbok biltong downstairs from my sister-in-law, so I think I'll go have a nibble after the call ends.
I would just, before we close, I'd like to read a comment from Andy Klee. I see we have, yes, a comment from Andy Klee, and Andy says that he heard a great introduction in a talk given by activist Satish Kumar. He described visiting the London School of Economics and asked them where the ecology department was. They looked puzzled. He then explained the origins of the words from their Greek roots. Ekos meaning home, logos meaning knowledge, nomos meaning management, and asked how one could manage your home, economics, without knowledge about ecology. Alas, still no ecology department at LSE. And so I think with that said, if we do not have any further questions and anybody else, Frank, thank you very much for your very insightful talk. Thank you for everybody who's tuned in tonight. I think we have enjoyed hearing your vast knowledge of wildlife economies. And we look forward to the Conservation Symposium happening earlier next month. And for everybody else who joined in, thank you for tuning in. Good evening to those who are having an evening. Good morning to the people in Canada, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Prudence. I love that last quote. Fabulous. Thanks, everybody. We'll be in touch.
Goodbye.